My wife won $12 million, and the very same night, she told me to get out of our house. That's not an exaggeration. That's exactly how fast everything I thought I knew about marriage, love, and loyalty collapsed. My name is Daniel Foster. I'm 46 years old, and until last fall I believed I had a steady life figured out. Nothing flashy, but honest. I worked as a construction project manager in Raleigh, making close to $80,000 a year. My wife Melissa had a part-time job at an art studio downtown, earning just enough to feel busy but not pressed. We didn't have kids, but we had a cozy three-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood with maple trees and kids playing catch in the street. To me, that was happiness. That was enough. Melissa always joked about the lottery. She played the same numbers week after week. Birthdays, anniversaries, little milestones her family considered sacred. Every Saturday, she'd grin at me as she filled out the ticket. One day, "Danny, these numbers are going to change everything." I'd roll my eyes, kiss her on the forehead, and laugh it off. $12 million wasn't something that happened to people like us. But then, one Tuesday evening, she stood frozen in our kitchen, clutching a slip of paper so tightly her knuckles went white. Her eyes were wide, her lips trembling. "Danny," she whispered, "I think we just hit the jackpot." I took the ticket from her hand, scanned the numbers once, then again, just to be sure. 12 million. After taxes, it was more than 8 million cash. My legs felt weak. I sat down at the table, staring at those numbers like they were written in fire. Melissa screamed and laughed, jumped into my arms, shouting, "We're rich. Do you realize what this means? We're free." She was crying tears of joy, and for a few hours that night, I believed her excitement was real. We popped open a cheap bottle of champagne, the one we'd been saving for some special occasion, and drank it out of coffee mugs because we didn't own flutes. For a brief, perfect moment, I thought the universe had finally decided to give us a break. But the very next morning, before the sun had burned the dew off the grass, Melissa's parents pulled into our driveway in their spotless silver SUV. George and Linda never hid their disdain for me. They came from money, the country club, old money kind of arrogance. And they never let me forget I was just the construction guy who got lucky marrying their daughter. That morning, though, they didn't even try to disguise their greed. They came in grinning, hugging Melissa, congratulating her like she'd single-handedly built a fortune. George slapped me on the back with the fakest smile I've ever seen. "Well, son, this is our family's big break," he said. "Our family. Not his daughter and her husband. Not us. The Wilson family." Within hours, Melissa's brother Travis showed up too, wearing a smug grin like he already had a claim on the winnings. Our small kitchen turned into a strategy meeting. They talked about financial advisors, investment portfolios, and luxury condos in Charlotte. I tried to cut in to ask what Melissa and I wanted to do with our windfall, but every time I opened my mouth, the conversation froze. Eyes shifted, smirks passed around. I wasn't a husband in that room. I was an outsider. Over the next week, my wife became someone I didn't recognize. She took long calls behind closed doors, whispered late into the night with her parents, and stopped meeting my eyes when I asked simple questions. "Danny, you just don't understand," she said one evening when I pressed her about our plans. "Dad knows how to protect money like this. We can't risk making stupid decisions." The way she said "we" felt wrong, like it didn't include me at all. 3 weeks later, Melissa sat me down in our living room. But she wasn't alone. George and Linda were perched on the couch, Travis leaning against the wall, all of them staring at me like a jury ready to deliver a verdict. Melissa's voice was flat, rehearsed. "Daniel, I think we should separate. This money, it's mine. I bought the ticket. I chose the numbers. I want it safe." My heart stopped. "Ours," I corrected, barely able to get the word out. "We're married. Everything we have is both of ours. That's what marriage means." George leaned forward, his voice cold as ice. "That's not how the law sees it, son. The prenup you signed protects Melissa. What's hers stays hers. What's yours stays yours. And this money is hers." I stared at them. The people who had just weeks ago toasted with champagne in my kitchen, now speaking like I was some stranger who had wandered into their meeting. Melissa couldn't even look at me. Finally, she whispered, "I want you to leave. Tonight." I stood slowly, my chest tight, my hands shaking. 8 years of loyalty, sacrifices, compromises, all tossed aside the moment fortune landed in our lap. I looked at my wife, The woman I had once believed loved me without condition, and all I saw was calculation. Fine, I said, my voice steady though my insides burned. I'll pack my things. Melissa's shoulders slumped with relief, as though she'd feared a fight. Her family smirked like they'd just won. They thought I'd roll over, vanish quietly into the night, and leave them to their millions. But as I stuffed clothes into an old duffel bag, I felt something sharper than heartbreak taking root inside me. They thought the prenup was their shield. What they didn't realize was that sometimes the weapons people forge to protect themselves are the very blades that end up cutting them down. The night I carried my duffel bags out of the house I had once called home, I didn't cry, and I didn't beg. I drove my old pickup through the dark streets of Raleigh with my jaw clenched so tightly it ached. The neon sign of a budget extended stay motel flickered in the distance, and that's where I pulled in, handing over a credit card that already carried too much weight. The room smelled of mildew and burnt coffee, but as I shut the door behind me, I realized something important. Melissa and her family thought they had stripped me of everything: my marriage, my home, even my dignity. But what they had really done was light a fire I didn't know I had. They believed I was just a construction guy who would shuffle off quietly into the shadows. They had no idea that I was about to fight them on their own ground. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of the stiff mattress, staring at the peeling wallpaper, replaying every moment of that living room ambush. The look on Melissa's face, the smug smirk on Travis's mouth, the cold certainty in George's voice. They thought they were untouchable, protected by that prenuptial agreement her family had forced me to sign years ago. But I remembered that document. I had skimmed it back then, too in love to care, but something about its wording stuck in my head. And I had kept a copy, buried in an old filing cabinet. They thought I was naive, but I was about to show them how wrong they were. The next morning, I made a call to a lawyer whose name I'd heard whispered at construction sites whenever a coworker went through a divorce. His name was Richard Malone. They said he was ruthless, a man who could find cracks in a contract no one else could see. His consultation fee was more than a month of my rent, but when he answered the phone with a curt, gravelly voice, I felt the first surge of hope I'd had in weeks. By noon, I was in his office, sitting across from him as he flipped through the prenup with slow, deliberate care. Malone was a tall man with weathered features, the kind of lawyer who had clearly lived in courtrooms for decades. He wore a plain gray suit, no flashy watch, no unnecessary words. He read line by line, his expression unreadable. My palms sweated as I waited, wondering if I had just wasted the last of my savings. Finally, he set the document down and gave me a look that made my pulse quicken. "Daniel," he said, his voice low and steady, "your in-laws aren't nearly as smart as they think they are. This agreement? It might just be your ticket to justice." I leaned forward, heart pounding. "What do you mean?" He tapped a paragraph on the third page with a thick finger. "This clause right here. Section 4.3. It states that any assets, prizes, or winnings acquired during the marriage shall be considered marital property, subject to division upon divorce." They were so worried about keeping their old money separate that they wrote this into your contract. They essentially handed you the keys to half of her so-called personal fortune. I stared at him, barely breathing. "But her father said." "Her father isn't the law," Malone cut in sharply. "In North Carolina, lottery winnings are considered marital property unless explicitly excluded by agreement. This prenup doesn't exclude them. It does the opposite. It nails the door shut. If she won those millions while you two were married, then legally, you're entitled to half." A slow, cold smile spread across my face. The very contract they had shoved in my hands before the wedding, the contract they thought would protect their family fortune from me, was the weapon I could use to take back what was rightfully mine. Malone wasn't finished. He opened a yellow legal pad and started jotting notes. "We'll need bank records, proof of the ticket purchase, and evidence of how she's already spending the winnings. If she's mixing it with other marital funds, that strengthens your case. And believe me, people with sudden money always make mistakes. She'll leave a trail." I walked out of that office into the crisp autumn air with a strange sensation I hadn't felt since this nightmare began: power. For weeks, Melissa and her family had been whispering behind closed doors, plotting my exile, counting their millions while treating me like dirt under their shoes. But now, I had a seasoned lawyer, a strategy, and a prenup they had written with their own arrogance. Back at the motel, I pulled out my laptop and scrolled through Melissa's social media. What I found made me laugh out loud in the dimly lit room. There she was, draped in new designer clothes, sipping champagne at a rooftop bar, posing beside a brand new luxury SUV with a caption, "New Beginnings." Travis commented with fire emojis. Her mother gushed about how proud she was. And in every single photo, Melissa tagged the purchases to our joint checking account. She wasn't even hiding it. I saved every screenshot, every receipt, every photo where she flaunted her spending. Each one was a nail in the coffin of the case she thought she'd already won. For the first time in weeks, I slept soundly. And as I lay there, the thought echoed in my mind. They thought they could erase me, but what they'd really done was give me the chance to write the ending myself. The weeks that followed turned into a battle I had never imagined fighting. Yet I was more prepared for it than Melissa and her family could ever guess. Malone worked like a surgeon, precise and merciless. He filed motions, collected evidence, and dug through every detail of our financial life with the patience of a hunter stalking prey. Each evening, after long days on construction sites, I'd meet him in his office where the smell of stale coffee and leather-bound law books clung to the air. He would slide a new stack of papers across the desk, his eyes gleaming behind those wire-rimmed glasses. "Another nail in their coffin," he'd mutter, and I would sign whatever he put before me. Melissa, meanwhile, was parading around town like she'd been crowned royalty. She bought herself a gleaming black Range Rover, parked it in front of her parents' estate like a trophy. Travis posted pictures of the whole family eating at the most expensive steakhouse in Raleigh, champagne glasses raised high. I watched all of it online, my jaw set tight. Every purchase, every smug smile, every careless post became ammunition. Malone's assistant printed them all, building a file so thick it looked like a family photo album of greed. The first time we met in court, I felt my pulse hammer in my ears. The Wake County Courthouse was packed that morning, not with reporters yet, but with curious faces. People who knew Melissa's family, people who had always seen me as the working-class guy who married above his station. They whispered as I walked by in my only suit, the navy one I had bought for our wedding 8 years earlier. Melissa sat on the opposite side with her parents and their high-priced attorney, a slick man named Jonathan Pierce. He had the look of a man who charged $1,000 an hour just to smirk. His cufflinks sparkled under the fluorescent lights as he leaned down to whisper in Melissa's ear, and she laughed softly, as though none of this was serious, as though she had already won. When the judge entered and the session began, Pierce strutted forward like a peacock. "Your Honor," he declared, his voice smooth and confident, "this case is nothing more than a bitter husband attempting to claim money that is not, and never was his. My client purchased the winning ticket with her own funds. She alone selected the numbers. She alone redeemed the winnings. The prenuptial agreement signed in 2016 makes it abundantly clear that her property remains her property." I could feel the eyes of the courtroom on me, waiting to see if I would fold under the weight of his words. But Malone simply rose from his chair, calm as a man strolling through a park. He adjusted his tie, held up the prenup, and spoke with the clarity of a hammer striking steel. "Your Honor, Section 4.3 of this very document, drafted by counsel for the Wilson family, states in no uncertain terms that any assets, prizes, or winnings acquired during the marriage are marital property, not separate property. Marital. The defendants want to ignore the words they themselves insisted upon because the windfall was larger than they expected. The law does not bend to convenience." The judge, a stern woman with sharp glasses, leaned forward. "Mr. Pierce, is this true? Does the agreement contain such language?" For the first time, Pierce faltered. He shuffled his papers, cleared his throat, and muttered, "It does, Your Honor." But the clause was not intended to cover extraordinary sums such as, "The court is not interested in intent," the judge interrupted, "only in the words written and signed." I will never forget the look Melissa shot across the courtroom at me then. It was a mixture of shock and fury, like a queen discovering her crown had slipped. Her parents stiffened in their seats, and Travis rubbed the back of his neck nervously. For the first time, the smug confidence in their posture cracked. And for the first time, I allowed myself to smile. The weeks that followed were grueling. Depositions, financial disclosures, endless paperwork. Malone coached me through every step. Stay calm. Be factual. Don't give them an inch, he repeated like a mantra. Melissa, on the other hand, grew increasingly reckless. She claimed she had always intended the winnings to be her personal property, but bank records showed otherwise. Every ticket she'd bought for the last 5 years came from our joint checking account, the one I deposited my paychecks into. Every fancy dinner, every designer purchase, every new luxury toy came directly from the winnings deposited into accounts still bearing both of our names. When these records were presented, Pierce's polished confidence began to wear thin. He tried to argue intention again, but intention couldn't erase receipts. Intention couldn't erase her social media posts flaunting our new life while tagging our joint account. Intention couldn't erase the prenup language that her family's own lawyer had written with smug precision years earlier. One evening, after another long session of combing through records, Malone leaned back in his chair and chuckled. Daniel, I don't think you understand how badly they've cornered themselves. They thought they could build a fortress around their money, but in doing so, they left the drawbridge wide open. All we had to do was walk in. I left his office that night with my head held higher than it had been in months. The city lights of Raleigh glowed against the dark sky as I drove back to my motel. For the first time since Melissa had shoved me out of our home, I no longer felt like a man defeated. I felt like a man on the edge of justice. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. But every piece of evidence we uncovered, every arrogant mistake Melissa and her family made, every clause in that prenup they had written to protect themselves became another brick in the case we were building. They had underestimated me from the beginning. Now, they were starting to learn what happens when you push a man too far. The morning of the final hearing, I stood in front of the mirror of my motel bathroom adjusting the same navy blue suit I had worn on my wedding day. The irony wasn't lost on me. That suit had once been a symbol of devotion and promise. Today, it was armor. My hands trembled slightly as I straightened my tie, but it wasn't fear. It was anticipation. After months of being treated like a fool, after weeks of depositions and paperwork, after nights alone in a motel room staring at ceilings and replaying betrayals, I was finally about to stand in front of a judge and face the people who had tried to erase me. The courthouse buzzed with an energy I could feel the moment I stepped through the heavy doors. Local reporters with notepads in hand, curious onlookers whispering in the hallways, even a few old neighbors who had once waved at me from their porches but now craned their necks to watch the drama unfold. Melissa arrived in a tailored white dress, her hair styled perfectly, her parents on either side like bodyguards. Travis trailed behind, smirking as if this were all some sort of sporting event. Their lawyer, Pierce, strutted in with his designer briefcase, scanning the room as though he owned it. I caught Melissa's eyes for just a second. They were cold, calculating, but I thought I saw a flicker of doubt hiding beneath the polished exterior. When the bailiff called the court to order and the judge took her seat, my heart pounded so loudly I could hear it echo in my ears. Pierce was the first to speak, and he launched into his performance with every ounce of charm and bravado he had. Your Honor, this case is simple, he said smoothly, gesturing toward Melissa. A loyal daughter, a responsible woman, fortunate enough to have her numbers drawn in the lottery. She purchased the ticket herself with her own funds. This windfall belongs solely to her. Mr. Foster is seeking to exploit language never intended to cover such extraordinary winnings. He is, in essence, attempting to rewrite the meaning of marriage to his own advantage. His words flowed like silk, and I could feel the eyes of the room shift toward me, some with pity, others with skepticism. But then Malone rose. He didn't stride or preen. He simply walked to the center of the room, placed the prenup on the lectern, and let the silence hang for a beat. Your Honor, he began, his voice calm but commanding. Marriage is many things: love, partnership, sacrifice. But it is also a legal contract. And contracts are not rewritten after the fact simply because the results displease one party. Section 4.3 of this prenuptial agreement, drafted by counsel for the Wilson family, states clearly and without ambiguity that any assets, prizes, or winnings acquired during the marriage are marital property. Not personal. Marital. Those are the words their lawyer chose. Those are the words both parties signed. Those are the words the law recognizes. And that is the truth. The judge leaned forward, steepling her fingers. I could see Melissa shifting in her seat, her mother whispering frantically in her ear. Pierce tried to interject, but Malone held up a stack of bank statements. And furthermore, he continued, we have irrefutable proof that every lottery ticket Mrs. Foster purchased for the last 5 years came from a joint account funded by both spouses' income. This win was not a solitary act of luck. It was the continuation of a shared marital habit financed by marital funds. And in the weeks following her win, Mrs. Foster deposited the winnings into accounts still bearing both names, then used those funds for lavish purchases without consulting her husband. In legal terms, she commingled the asset. In human terms, she betrayed the partnership of marriage. The silence that followed was heavy. You could hear the shuffle of papers, the creak of wooden benches, the cough of someone in the back row. I watched the judge scribble notes, her face unreadable, but something in my chest told me we had turned the tide. Then Melissa was called to testify. She walked to the stand with stiff shoulders, her chin tilted upward, but her hands trembled as she swore her oath. Pierce guided her gently at first, asking her about her love for her family, her habit of playing those same numbers, her belief that the winnings were hers alone. Melissa spoke with a conviction that might have swayed someone unfamiliar with the facts. But when Malone rose for cross-examination, the mask cracked. Mrs. Foster, he began softly, you testified that you always intended to keep the winnings separate. Is that correct? She nodded firmly. Yes. Malone raised an eyebrow. Then why did you deposit them into a joint account? Why did you use those funds to pay bills, buy a car, cover expenses that benefited both of you? Melissa stammered. I needed somewhere to put the money at first. Malone's voice sharpened. And you had no other account in your name only? She hesitated. I did, but Malone cut in, but you didn't use it. Instead, you mixed the winnings with marital funds and then spent them freely. Correct? Melissa's face flushed red. She tried to glance at her parents, but the judge's eyes bore into her, demanding an answer. Finally, she whispered, yes. That single word echoed in the courtroom like a verdict before the verdict. By the time closing arguments ended, the tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. I sat at the table, staring at my folded hands, waiting. The judge cleared her throat and began. Her words were deliberate, careful, but each one struck like a hammer. The prenuptial agreement was valid. The language was clear. The winnings were marital property. The evidence proved commingling of funds. And the court ruled that I was entitled to half. Half. The number rang in my ears like a church bell. I turned my head and saw Melissa's face crumble, her father's jaw tighten, her brother's smirk vanish. For months they had looked at me like I was nothing, like I was disposable, like I would fade into the background of their shiny new fortune. But at that moment, in that courtroom, they realized I wasn't just a construction worker. I was a husband who refused to be erased. When the gavel came down, a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying lifted from my shoulders. Reporters outside shouted questions, microphones shoved toward my face, but I didn't stop for any of them. I stepped into the sunlight with my head held high, breathing free air again. Justice didn't erase the betrayal, and it didn't heal the wound Melissa had carved into my life. But it gave me something stronger than revenge. It gave me the dignity of knowing I had stood my ground and won. And now, as I look back on that chapter of my life, I realize that sometimes the very weapons people create to protect themselves become the blades that cut them down. They thought the prenup would lock me out forever. Instead, it opened the door I needed most. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below telling me what you think. Your support means everything, and there are more unbelievable stories on the way.